It's about 10 years since we started this journey after the global food price crisis. And at that time, I was delighted that we were able to bring food and agriculture and nutrition back together and back to the front of the global development agenda. I was daunted when it turned out that our metric in that work would be reducing child stunting. I'm an agriculturalist, and I thought, oh, wow, how are we going to do that? And what that has really unleashed is a journey that we've taken together with our colleagues in nutrition and in health to try to really deliver on what matters. And I say that as an agriculturalist because I have always believed that the support we receive to work on food and agriculture is about the human outcomes. It's about putting the human face on our work, whether it's upstream research or working in extension with farmers on improving their productivity or the food safety of their products. So it's been a wonderful collaboration, and I think there's no better place than Nepal to talk about this. We've had Kisan and other projects from Feed the Future. We've had Srihara with a tremendous record of achievement from the health and nutrition side. And we've had the great benefit of having the Nutrition Innovation Lab here, bringing the best of global science to bear in partnership with Nepali researchers to really understand what's happening and what's driving the outcomes we care about. And I'm very grateful for the collaboration with people like Patrick and Shabani and Jerry Shively and my colleague Ahmed Kablan. And also, Nepal has a special place in AID in part because our nutrition leader in the Global Health Bureau is Ann Peniston, who served here for many years, and I'm sure many of you will remember Ann Peniston. And my colleague Elaine Gray is also here from the Health Bureau. So this is a true partnership in my agency. I've also, in my preparing my remarks this morning, leaned a little bit on IFPRI, or maybe more than a little bit. It's the International Food Policy Research Institute. But I'm going to speak to you as an agriculturalist, and I'm going to try to focus on the context. There are a lot of people in this room, all of you more than me, that can explain what's really happening at the farm and household level in terms of nutrition outcomes. But what I will try to do, if you will, is step back and look at the whole agricultural and food system and how we can get to yes, as the title of my talk suggests. So I'd like to start with the review, an update of what's happening, a little bit about how we're refining our strategy as we learn together, and then come into the Nepal context with some examples, and then leave you with a few thoughts that I hope will be useful takeaways. So now we'll see if I can do this. Yes. Okay, so let's start with some good news. As you can see, there's been progress. We see the Sustainable Development Goals. We see agriculture and nutrition back together. We see stunting coming down, but still too high. In the United States, we're very grateful that our Congress passed and the President signed a 5-year extension of the Global Food Security Act, authorizing $1 billion a year to continue this work. But there's also some bad news. In the last 2 years, we've seen a huge increase in the amount of severe acute malnutrition, of hunger, even famines, multiple famines in the world, something that we hoped was past history. I'll just say, I made the points, I had a slide that I don't see that talks about the prevalence of undernourishment being cut in half. Extreme poverty is also going down in the last 20 years. In both cases, Africa is lagging. And then we have a map, I had a map to show you of the global extent of micronutrient deficiencies. And interestingly, that's almost a complete match with a global map of stunting. And there we still have a lot of work cut out for us in both sub-Saharan Africa and especially South Asia. So this is why the work you're all involved in is so important. I also want to remind you all that it's not a question of one size fitting all. Yes, nutrition challenges have a global program, are a global problem, and they look different in different parts of the world. But in the low-income countries, there are still huge challenges with undernutrition with respect to both both calories and diet quality. And those challenges are shared elsewhere, but they're particularly acute here. And I will tell you that in our Congress, and I think in development agencies around the world, it's really those challenges relating to undernutrition and micronutrient deficiency and all the things that we are so conscious of as being limitations to human achievement and potential. Those are the things that drive the investment. So showing that we can deliver progress in reducing hunger and undernutrition is I think, very significant. I also would like to just remind us all that, oh, there's the slide I was looking for. Okay, well, you can see that map at the bottom. If you look and see where the micronutrient deficiency is, it pretty much maps where stunting is still high. I think that's a signal about diet quality, and we're going to talk more about that as we go on here. So another thing to just remind us all, it's the poor that suffer the most. And this is 4 different countries. Nepal is not listed, I apologize, but it's World Bank data. But as you can see, it's the poorest quintiles in the population that have the highest rates of stunting. Another point that's not a new point, but worth reminding ourselves, is the Lancet work from a little over 10 years ago that showed us that income and nutrition gains are related. So that's good. The problem is that there's not a perfect correlation. It's about a 0.6 correlation in terms of gains in income being reflected as gains in nutrition. So I think what we want to do in our work is figure out how to push both those curves upward, because remember, agriculture is the most pro-poor kind of growth in terms of driving economic gains that are pro-poor. But also we want to push that nutrition line up. What ideally we'd like is that nutrition line to be above the income line. In other words, we'd like to see a faster gain in nutrition even than we're able to gain in terms of economic well-being. So that's our challenge, I think. So what works? Well, I think you could tell me better, but this is what we traditionally think of as our nutrition-specific interventions. You can see the examples here about child feeding and breastfeeding and micronutrient supplementation and health and care, all these things that our colleagues in Swahara and many other organizations excel at doing. And that's great, and it's absolutely critical. But what we found out about 5 years ago is that those interventions by themselves would not deliver the kind of reductions in stunting that the world is looking for. If we do everything right, over 90% of the population, they told us we might only get a 20% decrease in stunting. Well, this was sobering for all of us. On the other hand, it also gave rise in my agency, and I think elsewhere, to the emergence of what's really the multi-sectoral approach to nutrition and the strategy that recognizes that to get this critical human outcome, we're going to have to run on all cylinders. And what are those cylinders? So the next slide is one that I got from Marie Ruel at IFPRI, but it's actually Lawrence Haddad and Lisa Smith work, a review of the literature. And there are 3 different colors, or 3 color groups, let's say. The upper left is the food, and that is a driver of about 1/3 of what else is going on besides nutrition-specific interventions in terms of achieving stunting. And this is a wide literature review that generated that. And you can see that, or you maybe can't see, but those 2 colors of green, one is staples calories and one is non-staple calories. So both quality and quantity of food. And then in the upper right, water and sanitation. And that's about evenly split between water and sanitation. And then who's got an idea of what the largest blue-colored group is at the bottom? I don't have a prize for the right answer, but okay, it's women's empowerment. And it's actually women's education, but that's a metric for empowerment. And I think that's a surrogate for all kinds of things: care, being able to make better decisions, to access information. So that's critically important. All those 3 things, along with all the nutrition and health interventions that we talked about earlier, are needed to really drive down stunting and improve nutrition. So this led to this idea of nutrition-sensitive pathways. And this, I don't think, is new to many of you. And it led to the emergence of a whole area of effort in my agency and elsewhere around what we call nutrition-sensitive agriculture. So this focused on nutrient-rich foods, behavior change communication to try to drive the consumption of the quality foods, market presence, the availability of foods in the market and year-round access, food safety, and of course, very importantly, the ability of women to make better decisions because of either having a better access to information or perhaps greater say over the allocation of household resources. So this has led to a whole flowering of effort, and I know it's going on here in Nepal and in all the places we work. Now, about last year, Marie Ruel and some other colleagues at IFPRI did a review of how we've done on nutrition-sensitive agriculture. And you probably can't read all of this, but what I'll tell you is that there are many gains that come from the kinds of biofortification, household food production, livestock value chains. And we've had many gains in areas like intakes of fortified products, reducing anemia, dietary diversity for especially for mothers, but older children. But it's been much harder to get the outcomes in terms of measurement, in terms of child stunting. So that remains somewhat elusive, although not completely. But her conclusions are that we need stronger program designs, we need women's empowerment. We can impact on many important things, so that's good news. Things like diet, as I mentioned, and nutrient intake, maybe even anemia, which is exciting. But it's limited in terms of stunting. There are also some association studies that suggest that things like ownership of livestock can be significant determinants, with caveats. The livestock has to be managed carefully, and this is, and I know some of our colleagues from the livestock community are here with us today, so that issue of hygiene comes into play significantly there. She and her colleagues also concluded, interestingly, that perhaps we ought to be thinking about, not necessarily making things overly complex, but figuring out how to work in synergy with each other, not maybe trying to make every project do everything. And I think that's probably what's here in Nepal. We have tried to look for synergies across various types of engagements. So interesting stuff. And then one example I wanted to share from that is this one, which showed the example of what water and sanitation was able to do along with lipid-based nutrient supplementation. Those two things together were actually able to reduce stunting, and this is from Burkina Faso, and they also reduced iron deficiency anemia. So that's very exciting from where I sit, because that remains a huge challenge for us globally. And again, I think as an indicator, and I know those of you from the medical field could tell us that there's many things that drive that, but certainly diet quality is one of them, and it's the one thing that those of us in the agriculture community and the development community can work with you on trying to deliver better. So a few broader impacts, stepping back from some research by Will Masters, Carl Prey, and Sabrina Ayub. Last year they did a review for us, and we see things like this study that shows modern variety introduction being, they say, leads to a large decline in infant mortality. I have to say, it's hard for me to think about exactly what leads to means there, but I think perhaps it's correlation, and maybe it's a marker for agricultural transformation, that broadly good things are happening, and that is making a difference in infant mortality reduction. And then Masters also showed a couple years ago that agricultural productivity gains can drive the development of cities and towns. So not just big cities, but towns all across a country like Nepal. And that those towns, in turn, end up helping improve nutrition outcomes for children who remain in the rural areas. So that makes you think maybe something going on here around markets, around availability, around economic opportunity. So a very interesting finding there. And then I think this, staying on this system of markets, this last study suggests that just the presence of markets can make a huge impact in terms of smoothing shocks and helping ensure that people are not as isolated. Maybe they're not as subject to seasonal variation if there's a reliable market that is working well and that they can access, both as purchasers, perhaps also as suppliers. And we're looking at this as a key factor in resilience. This is something that you'll hear a lot of talk about these days. This is the idea that how can we work such that our partners, be they countries, communities, families, organizations, when a shock comes along, a flood, a drought, an earthquake, that they are better able to get through that shock and survive and reinvest in that next season to be able to get back on their feet. This is a more recent conceptual framework from Derek Hetty that I really like. It has a human lens there with the agri-food biology, which foods impact which outcomes. Food acceptability is there, very important. Food affordability. I think this is one of the things that I'm going to really try to emphasize that this is an area where we're learning more about how much food costs, and especially for the poor, and how much quality foods cost, things like dairy and eggs and fish and other things. Food accessibility around things like infrastructure and seasonality, and food safety, of course. So I like this very much. The access and the issue of market failure, taking into account things like spatial, which in a country like Nepal is hugely important given your topography that's very variable across the country. The agroecology, that has a lot of impacts on what can be grown and what happens at different times of year, and seasonality of supply. So now I'm going to harken back to something that I would call oldie but goodie. So this is some work that's from the 90s from Martin Blohm. He's a name maybe familiar to some of you most recently with the World Food Program, where he looked at rice expenditure and underweight, and how what we saw was that the more people spent on rice in Bangladesh, the higher incidence of underweight babies there were. This is through the 90s. And then he looked further, and what is happening there is also that as rice prices go up, people spend more on rice and less on other things in their diet. So less on milk, less on eggs, less on vegetables, less on fish. And this correlates, in fact, with underweight children. So there's an inverse there between the amount spent for non-rice foods and a positive outcome in terms of nutrition. And I think even though this is old data, I think it's still compelling, and we shouldn't forget it. And then taking this affordability theme forward. So this is the work of Derek Hetty. He says cheap calories are favored. You've all heard of the full belly syndrome, right? If you're really poor and hungry, you want to not be hungry. You want to fill up. So if rice is the cheapest thing, you're going to buy rice and you'll feel less hungry. But then he says if people have a little more money, they go for tasty food. Well, that's very good. Or is it? Because tasty food isn't always the most nutritious and healthy food. We're hardwired as human beings to love salt and fat. Well, you know, if they're cheap enough, maybe we're going to eat too much of them, and that isn't a good thing. On the other hand, we're also hardwired to like things like dairy and eggs and fish and other foods that are very good for us. So there's an opportunity there, and I think the role of information and behavior change communication is really a critical one in driving this transition. And then as incomes go up, people diversify their diets. But the part that I think is new in terms of understanding here is that they do it based on relative prices. So it's not just the price of one thing, it's how everything is priced vis-a-vis each other. And so these researchers looked at the effect of price. This is a global thing. Let's say they started with the non-animal source foods. So that would be everything that we think of in terms of cereals and pulses and vegetables. And they said that they found that affordability appears to be less of a constraint. They were looking at the cost of calories across different kinds of foods. But there are still major seasonality issues, and I personally think this needs a lot more work because we know that in many parts of the world, especially the drier it is, vegetables are expensive. Vegetables are mostly water. If you have a long dry season somewhere, there are not many vegetables in the market. And this is another reason why I think I as an agriculturalist and my colleagues are so interested in irrigation in areas where it can mean more year-round water access, not necessarily to grow whole fields, but to grow some vegetables that can be consumed and sold, to maybe keep more in the way of poultry or livestock. So water is a critical constraint there, I think. And then for animal source foods, they are much more expensive in low-income countries than they are in my country, for example, or in Europe or other regions. And relative prices matter. There are agroecological constraints for many of them. Things like milk and egg are non-tradables. They're not widely traded. So there's some policy implications here too. Fish can be traded, but it's often very much lacking in areas that don't have a lot of water. So that's again something that we can think about. So there are things that we can think about. This talks about milk being expensive, especially in Africa. South Asia, it's a little more affordable because of livestock diseases, but I added in also the shortage of feed and just an overall lack of water. Remember, milk is, 95% water? So you got to have a lot of water to have a lot of dairy. And then eggs, in many cases, they're low productivity in backyard production systems, and I know those can be important, but as overall, they don't drive down egg prices. And then the other issue is Newcastle's disease, which can go through every year or two and wipe out your flock. So I'm actually going to say that, sometimes we want multiple approaches on a problem, and I think in the case of, for example, the price of eggs, we may want to see different kinds of egg production coming online, even in a country like Nepal. So let's zoom into Nepal now. This shows a good year in the Feed the Future zones, which is the Terai and mid-hills towards the west, and then a bad year in the Feed the Future zone. And this was from a colleague, Andy McDonald, and other colleagues at the CISA program, which has been an important partner to Naveen, Hada, and the rest of our agricultural team here at the USAID mission. And this is basically questioning the impacts of a good or bad year on self-reliance. And we don't really think about self-sufficiency so much, but self-reliance. But when you have a poor staple crop performance, so a poor crop of wheat or rice, or maybe lentil or chickpea, you're going to have greater nutritional insecurity. And so the assertion here is that greater resilience in poor years, in other words, some of the greater resilience to climate, be it drought or flood or other challenges, is actually nutrition friendly. So I think this is this idea that trying to be more resilient in terms of agricultural productivity can be one of the things that helps smooth the ups and downs in terms of a household trying to provide its members with an adequate and nutritious diet. And then there are some other things we can do in the agriculture sector. Here's a picture of the eastern Indo-Gangetic Plains, and it's basically what we have learned is that because of the early onset of heat in the spring, by planting earlier, a few weeks or a month earlier in the fall, you can get 1, 2, maybe even 3 tons more yield from your wheat crop than if you delay planting. So this means trying to shift to rice that's out of the field earlier, wheat that can go in earlier, and can make a huge difference in yields, and again be help smooth the shocks with which the price of chapatis may vary for the poor by virtue of providing a better supply of this critical staple. What about things like micronutrients in some of our major foods? Some of them are major suppliers, and zinc is a good example. This shows the distribution of zinc deficiency in the Terai soils where rice is grown, And in over 60% of the soils in the Terai, you have very high, very low levels of zinc, which means that the rice that comes from there tends to be lower zinc. And what we can do is, by planting the right kind of rice that's able to absorb more zinc, we can actually increase the zinc. We can also do zinc fertilization, and some farmers do, but not many, that increases the zinc. And then very importantly, at the bottom of that slide, that lowest graph shows what happens if you do a mid-season drying spell in rice. And what you get is a huge boost in the uptake of zinc into the rice crop. So it becomes much more nutritious in terms of zinc, providing zinc, just by some actually economically friendly agronomy, by letting things dry out for a little bit and thus making those nutrients more available. So these may all be subtle, but these are things that the farmers and agriculture can do to try to make their products more nutritious. And when we think of micronutrients, I think traditionally we've thought about the role of pulses, and especially in South Asia, where pulses are so important in the diet, but where, as you know better than I, they have become relatively more expensive over time. The reason for that? Cereal yields have gone way up. Pulse yields have been much more stagnant. And in the lentil here in Nepal, for example, in the Terai, we've been seeing in recent years is rains coming during the dry season and the cool season, which greatly increases the disease and lowers the yields. So again, by planting earlier, by taking climate into account, we have a better chance of getting a higher lentil yield. And I think similarly with chickpea, both of which I think are highly esteemed foods in a country like Nepal that eats dal and chana and all. It's very important for nutrition and for both protein and micronutrients. So that's another winner. And then something new that I'm really excited about is the hot season, the time of year when there tends to be nothing in the field. Now with where you have irrigation, mung bean is coming in, and mung bean is tremendously high yielding. It can be 5 tons per hectare. And excitingly, we saw over 30% of the mung bean being consumed within the households, which is really exciting because this is a high quality food. It is a great addition to the diet, and it can help make pulses more affordable and help improve the quality of the diet plate so that there's more room on that plate if you're poor to have some nice dal along with your rice. Aflatoxin, again, this is an area where the Nutrition Innovation Lab has been leading in terms of understanding it, but we do know that over half the samples that were tested just recently from the mid-hills of maize had above the level of 20 parts per billion. In other words, they should not be eaten, ideally. But there are things we can do in the production stage and post-harvest stage to help drive that. Here's an example of a sheller that saves women a lot of work, but also makes it much easier to dry the grain and thus reduce the level of aflatoxin. Here's a reminder of which foods are the top 10 in vitamins. And what does everybody notice here? These are animal source foods. Now, fortunately, I see milk and cheese and eggs and fish. So we see things that are commonly eaten here in poultry in Nepal. Dietary preferences matter, of course, but these are the top deliverers in terms of those micronutrients we talked about. And then this is from Lindsay Allen, a colleague at USDA, a leading nutritionist, who shows globally that anywhere where animal source foods account for less than 15% of the diet, you get higher rates of vitamin B12 deficiency. So this is, again, a reminder to us that animal source foods, which are expensive, matter, and they matter greatly to nutrition. So what are some opportunities? Well, winter fallows. I mentioned the hot season fallows, but where you have irrigation, particularly in maybe the wetter areas of eastern Terai, the opportunity to expand production during the cooler season is great. And things like maize are coming on, and that's being driven by the poultry industry, which in turn can make eggs cheaper. So let's not rule out the importance of feed and fodder crops. Also, great opportunity for growing forage crops for greater dairy production. So Nepal has still huge, not necessarily fully exploited opportunities that can make animal source foods more affordable and available. And then looking to Bangladesh, what we've seen there is a revolution in terms of aquaculture. And this just gives you an idea of how rapidly things have changed. And there's a lot of home consumption, but a lot of them are sold into the cities. It's almost all domestically consumed because these aren't necessarily traded, but it's also driving job creation and income opportunities all across an agricultural food system, because post-harvest value preservation is critical, value addition is critical, and all of this has, at the end of the day, it's helping to make fish more available and affordable for low-income Bangladeshis. I believe there are similar opportunities in parts of Nepal, in the Eastern Terai. This is not where USAID works necessarily, but I think the opportunity for developing aquaculture in your country is an exciting one, and I hope that's a journey that we and some of our partners, we have a new fish innovation lab, there's the World Fish Center that some of you know, can be partners in going forward in that area. Some priority products. I thought this was interesting. Basically, they're trying to look at things like producer incomes, that rural poverty. On the lower right side, the economic surplus that grows the agricultural GDP, and the diet quality. And what you can see is there's a lot of winners, and the ones with stars like poultry and eggs, cattle, dairy, these are ones that also have a lot of job creation associated with them. So we see vegetables, maize and fish, oil seeds, pulses, all of these have a role to play in taking us towards an agri-food system that can deliver on nutrition. And this is at a global analysis. This includes cassava. So you're not going to prioritize cassava here, but as you know, each country can think about how do we get this mix that's most likely going to provide a diet that really is nutrition friendly. So, summing up, I'd like to just leave you with these thoughts. Staples and non-staples are both important, especially for the poor. And productivity gains matter. These are the things that drive incomes, but especially affordability. So this is why I think in an area like eggs, we need to think not only of backyard production, but also opportunities that help the private sector invest in larger scale poultry and the feed that goes into those, the maize, for example, for the poultry feed. And a lot of those are going to be private goods, but getting the policies right and recognizing that these can be nutrition-friendly outcomes for the poor is, I think, a big part of what we need to be thinking about collectively. We clearly, the importance of gender is clear. Urbanization, I don't see it as much as a problem as an opportunity for the poor in rural areas to really help provide the growing incomes and demands of people in cities and towns for a wider array of diverse quality foods, things like fruits and vegetables, things like eggs and dairy, fish. So there's an opportunity here that's very much win-win for both nutrition for the poor everywhere, rural and urban, but also for income growth amongst poorer rural households. The importance of diversity in production is probably inverse with market access. In other words, the better you are connected to markets, the less you have to diversify your production and you can specialize more. Whereas if you're in a hinterland area with little market access, then thinking about how do we try to get as much of a healthy, nutritious diet from a more diverse production system local is an important thing to think about. So it's not one size fits all, okay? One of my favorite sayings. Animal source foods, we'd like to think they're a triple win: income, nutrition, resilience. And then the flip side of that, though, is they're knowledge intensive. We have to think about production, things like fish and poultry and dairy and livestock. There's opportunities for investment at all levels, but there's also needs around food safety, around preservation, around marketing and sophistication to maximize the benefits from those. So finally, my wish list. Knowledge, technology, and capitalization for smallholder systems. So things like small-scale irrigation, mechanization like less drudgery, like those corn shellers, better storage, less lost and waste, diversification into higher value, higher nutrition opportunities. Major productivity affordability gains, especially for quality nutritious foods. That's how poor consumers can benefit the most, if we can make those foods more affordable. And then finally, looking at our work around production, market, and policy systems as a source of an affordable diet. Another, looking at the whole, what are we delivering as an agri-food system that's going to be a positive contributor to reducing micronutrient deficiency, reducing stunting, and improving a whole range of dietary factors, diversity, quality, and so forth. So I thank you very much for your attention. Again, now it's my turn to start listening to you, where I have a lot to learn. But we're really excited to be a partner with all of you, and I'm speaking for all my colleagues in USAID and our partners when I say how pleased we are to be in this partnership together with all of our friends in Nepal. Thank you.